In 1831, the British government sent a captain and a crew to Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru aboard a warship called HMS Beagle, and their aim was to chart the harbors and defend the empire's interests in the Americas. But while most of the company surveyed the coastlines, one member of the crew, a newly minted university student, spent his time observing life. For 5 years, the 22-year-old Charles Darwin composed notes on habits and habitats, genes and geology, reefs and species, and despite being both seasick and homesick, he writes of the sheer awe that he felt on seeing the tropics and fossils for the first time as he catalogued the Galapagos' stunning biological inventory. But he saw more than just raw zoology. He encountered human cultures beyond his wildest dreams. And one day, as the Beagle cruised down the Colorado by the Rio Negro, he beheld a grand trunk that was clearly treated as a sacred tree, known to the natives as the altar of Walichu. And instead of leaves, the tree's branches suspended pieces of meat and bread and knitted threads, and it was encircled by the bleached bones of horses which had been slaughtered as offerings. And though the young naturalist writes that he cannot imagine why people would use a tree for religious worship, trees feature at the epicenter of ancient myth as symbols of power and fertility and towering longevity. Religions rooted in Sanskrit myth consider the Kalbavriksha to be a tree that fulfills wishes, and the Japanese see the Shinboku as a sacred tree, while the Norse peoples believed that a giant ash tree called Yggdrasil stands at the core of the cosmos, supporting all existence. And turning from myth to modern fiction, trees stand front and center too. Star Wars features the Ewoks of Endor who worship the forest, as do the Na'vi from James Cameron's Avatar, and a mystic white tree at the center of Middle Earth reflects the strength of the monarchy in Lord of the Rings. So widespread and prevalent is the belief that trees resemble or project divinity that it is no surprise that a sacred tree could be seen from the deck of the HMS Beagle. What is a surprise, though, is the stark warning that we read this morning from our supreme prophet who said, Lo tita lacha asherah kol eitz, you shall not plant a tree of any kind. Eitzel mizbach Hashem lokecha, near the altar of the Lord your God. And this prohibition on trees goes so far and so deep that our sages extended the ban in the temple to any wood at all. There were to be no platforms or scaffold or stages, no sign of lumber or hint of timber anywhere on temple grounds. And this is our question. Why do trees in particular threaten the truth of Jewish theology? Why do trees imperil the temple more than any other icon of idolatry? Why, when speaking to the people about our most sacred space, does Moshe depict trees as posing a unique danger to our faith? Now, for a whole range of commentators, God's hostility toward trees is simply a product of the pagan preoccupation with them and the need to distinguish our temple from theirs. As the Sforno puts it, Nim'eset lakodesh, trees are abhorred by heaven, mipnei shahaita tachsitz la'avoda gululim, because they are used by idolaters. But for a number of others, there is something more inherent about trees specifically that makes God deeply uneasy about seeing them in the temple. First, for Rabbi Alexander Zusia Friedman, a leading teacher and activist who was killed in the camps in 1943, there is something about trees in the temple that conflicts with the Jewish view of sanctity. For him, our faith, unlike other ideologies of the age, was committed to nurturing inner strength rather than outer beauty. So, where other creeds erected temples flooded with forestry and bathed in botany, heaven ordered us to leave our temple bare. In his words, Hamakom shehu kadosh be'emet, a place that is truly sacred. Einu tzarech l'shum bedek ve'yofi chitzoni, has no need for an aesthetic facade to aid it. So for him to embellish the temple or adorn the altar with leaves and trees and blossom is to invest an innately blessed edifice with the shallow stench of artifice. Sanctity is real and needs no floral garnish, and to decorate the temple with nature for him would amount to a profound deficiency in faith. In his words, Mare ata shelo ta'amin b'kedushat hamakom, it betrays a belief that the place lacks inherent sanctity. But second, we have his contemporary, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, who disagrees and suggests that God's objection to trees is less about an aesthetic misconception around sacred space and more about a rejection of a core tenet of our faith. Because trees, while symbols of strength and longevity and power and productivity, also depend on being fed. They rely on a steady stream of nutrients to fill their cells and color their leaves and build their rings. Whether it is agriculture or horticulture or arboriculture, trees require food through their roots to survive. And the implication of the pagan association of trees with their deities is that heaven relies on cultivation too. And we as a people have a very different model of God where our religious service is not to sustain him, but to shape us. In the words of the Meshech, Chochma makom hakorbanot hu davar she'eno nizon. The sacrificial location should not require maintenance, ve'en sarich lamayim umazon, and has no need for sustenance or water. The reason that trees on the temple would exemplify a form of religious treason is that their presence would imply that just as we depend on God, he relies on us. And this implication, however subtle or faint, threatens the essence of our faith and would replace our vision of a perfect God who nurtures us with a pagan conceit that we can feed him. Again, in his words, Kol inyan hamizbeach va'asiyoto, the whole idea of our altar and its operation, hulacha lesibatcha v'lishlamotecha, it is for our needs, to perfect us, not God. But there is one more reading I'd like to share with you. One made in the name of a medieval commentator called Rav Mordechai HaKohen, and for him the words of this verse emerge not as a polemic against ancient idolatry or as an objection to a superficial spirituality or as a rejection of pagan theurgic theology. Moshe warns our people, for Rav Cohen, that sometimes religious life, even in the context of sacrifice, can be contorted into a worship of the self. The verse says, Lo tita lecha asherah. Do not plant yourself an idolatrous tree, Eitzel mizbach Hashem Elokecha, next to the altar of the Lord your God. Lo tita lecha asherah. Do not plant yourself an idolatrous tree, which he reads as meaning, do not make yourself an idol. Lo ya'aseh ha'adam et atzmo avoda zara. Though, of course, Rav Cohen accepts a Meshech Chochmah's teaching that our faith sees religious service as about changing us rather than God, he adds that the change that God seeks is not in us alone, but for the world at large. If in religious life all our sacrifices are made solely for the sake of our own souls, we risk betraying our role as agents of divinity to the whole of humanity. Like trees leaching on the altar, we can impede the vision of the Psalter who sings in chapter 92, Shetulim b'veit Hashem. The pious are planted in the house of God, but b'chatzrot Elokeinu yafrichu, they flourish outside in the courtyard. As we draw closer to the days of awe, we can allow our self-reflection to descend into self-absorption, where our introspection and attempts at self-correction can obscure our obligation to direct our attention to those beyond our mental shores. So Moshe warns us, Lo titat lacha asherah. Do not make yourself an idol. Eitzel Mizbach Hashem, next to the altar of God. May our religious lives never blind us to our calling to open our eyes and enrich the lives of those around us, not simply to prune ourselves, but to perfect the world. May our sacrifices do more than sustain our souls, but gird us for our role as agents of attention and integrity who live to augment compassion, patience, and human dignity. And may our work on earth bring us all together closer to heaven. Shavua Tov.